China-U.S. relations under President Trump's administration have been a wild roller coaster. While trade tensions have been temporarily eased, the two countries failed to find the common ground on other fronts. Only days after President Trump announced a substantial Phase 1 trade deal with China, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, a gesture considered by the Chinese government as an intrusion into China's internal affairs. Is Washington's hostility towards Beijing affecting its own people, especially U.S. companies in China? What's their opinion on China's business climate? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to sit down with Craig Allen, President of the U.S. China Business Council. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome back to our program, sir.
Thank you so much.
What do you think of the latest development in our trade talks?
Well, we're very pleased that an agreement has been reached for the first phase of these discussions. And while the agreement is not complete or full, it's a great start. Moreover, it puts a floor under what had been continually deteriorating conditions. And that's a very good thing. The United States and China are the two world's largest economies. We have together 40% of global GDP, and therefore we must find a way to trade and invest in a predictable manner. We're not there yet, but at least we are headed in the right direction, and I very warmly welcome that.
There are shades of differences in the official statements from both sides about the results of this latest round of trade talks. However, both have adopted the same wording of substantial. What are your interpretations about the wording?
Well, I think that that implies that there has been an agreement in a number of key areas. One area would be Chinese purchases of American agricultural products to reduce the trade deficit. The second area would be on intellectual property rights, where we've seen a great deal of improvement already, but where we could see yet more improvement. The third area would be market access, and I think on the Chinese side there's been highlighting of financial services and insurance and banking and other types of financial services. And the fourth area has received less attention, but I think is also very important, would be on exchange rates. So this is not a lightweight agreement. All of these are very important areas. And if implemented fully, and we have seen in the past cases where implementation has not been ideal. So if implemented fully, then I think it's a very positive step forward. It is not the end of the journey.
The whole process of negotiations itself is a strong message that all sides in the game seek to understand, to figure out what it means for the future of the global economy. In your case, you might call it a marathon, but China may prefer to call it the long march. And it's also a journey of rediscovery for both sides.
Yes, that's true.
What is the most important message we have to learn from this process of rediscovery? Because we have to get along with each other as the two biggest economies, as you said earlier.
I would note, from a Chinese perspective, that the reforms requested by the American side are all WTO compatible, and in my view will accelerate sustainable Chinese economic growth for the next 10 years. That the reform process will be strengthened and expanded. And I do believe that this reform process will lead to those ends. That is, rather than 5 or 6% growth, 7 or 8% growth. And that marginal addition to growth is very important for the longer term. I think that your question is also important on the American side. On the American side, there is an enormous amount of debate about the U.S.-China relationship and what is the appropriate relationship within China. And that debate is by no means settled, not at all. And indeed, there are many, many different opinions. What my hope would be is that this provisional agreement will allow us to go out to the public in America and make the case that the U.S.-China relationship has delivered good economic benefits for Americans over the last 40 years, and that the Chinese side has made some commitments to ensure that that is sustainable, and that we welcome and embrace a bilateral relationship that is constructive, that is positive, that is moving forward, that is creating economic and cultural opportunities for Americans. And that an agreement will give us a foundation to make those arguments with much more enthusiasm and vigor than currently.
Very encouraging, Craig. We have been following the debates, both in China and the United States, about where we are heading in terms of the bilateral relationship, the most consequential one in the 21st century. Yes. There are 4 phrases to characterize friends, competitor, partner, adversary, and if you like, it could be a 5th, enemy. So which one do you prefer to call? Of course, friends are no longer taken seriously by most American policymakers regarding this bilateral relationship. But what about the other 4 options on the table?
So the U.S.-China relationship is very large and very complex. We have some 3 million Americans of Chinese ancestry in the United States. All of whom, or certainly the enormously large percentage of whom are strong, outstanding citizens in the United States. And I think that one could make an argument for all 4 of your labels, if you will. But let's be realistic and pragmatic. Over time, the competitive element of the relationship is becoming more and more apparent and more evident. And in my view, that is not a bad thing at all. Competition can make us stronger. Competition can strengthen us. Competition can make both sides better. But the competition needs to be smart competition and fair competition in accordance to rules. In a competition with no rules, then there can be, somebody's going to get hurt. But in a competition with good, strong rules, where both sides respect those rules, then both sides can be strengthened. And I think that that's what we should aim for, with rules that are reciprocally acknowledged and respected and enforced. And that should be the goal. And if we are able to get to that place, and I do believe that we can, then both of our countries will be able to advance independently and also together, and the rest of the world will benefit. If the competition becomes one in which there are no rules and where one could take negative steps against the other, in other words, rather than by becoming stronger and faster, making the other one weaker and slower, then we enter into dangerous ground. And if that were the case, then the relationship could evolve to becoming rivals. And I would fear worse than that. That is a scenario that can be avoided and one which we must work very hard to ensure does not take place. Both Americans and Chinese have an interest in emphasizing the collaborative, competitive parts of our relationship and of growing together. There is no benefit to anyone of seeing this relationship sink into one of those of enemies or those of bitter rivals. Rather, let us compete in a smart, fair, productive, constructive manner, and let us both get stronger together.
Since 40 years ago, the U.S. administration, starting from the Carter administration, has been pursuing one of engagement. But today, to our dismay, American friends have been discussing seriously whether they should disengage China or decouple the Chinese market. What would be the worst case consequences arising from your efforts to decouple China? And is it a realistic goal?
Sure. So the phrase that one hears, technology self-reliance, or indigenous innovation, what is that, may I ask, other than a form of decoupling? That is removing China from global supply chains and extracting foreign technology and replacing it with domestic technology.
I quickly noticed the understatement of your serious question as to self-reliance. It is President Donald Trump who ordered the cancellation of many agreements asking American companies to stop the supply of spare parts and important technology to their business partner like Huawei. You understand, I'm talking about the 5G. It is this decision by the White House that has led to the Chinese, or contributed to the Chinese concerns. Look, perhaps we should minimize our reliance on the American suppliers, and we should turn to our own self-reliance. This is the context in which the wording of self-reliance emerged. Don't you think so?
I'm afraid that the wording of self-reliance well predates Donald Trump, and that we have seen these policy moves over the last, say, 8 or 9 years in a consistent manner. And I would argue on both sides that an excessive or exaggerated perception of national security threat is leading to a form of decoupling that is negative for both sides. My point is that pointing at Donald Trump and saying that this is the reason why we are decoupling is probably mistaken. Rather, both governments have been moving in the opposite direction for some time. And I think that looking forward, one good paradigm is to try to keep decoupling to the true national security sensitive industries only, and not move beyond that. And that's something that both sides could do a much better job at.
You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Craig Allen, President of U.S. China Business Council. I'm very happy to do a very substantial interview with him about why substantial progress has been made for both sides, U.S. and China, in the latest round of trade talks. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. As the biggest economy, the most powerful military, the sole superpower in the wake of the Cold War, why do Americans feel unsafe?
In the United States, the process of globalization has led to the collapse of a good number of labor-intensive industries. And this has led to economic suffering, and there has been a populist reaction to that in the election of a populist president.
Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
Craig, it comes as no surprise that we have faced the issue of mistrust between the two countries, the two militaries, the two governments, to the least degree between the two peoples. But what surprised us most is that President Trump has also used the issue of national security in business negotiations with Canadians, Mexicans, Europeans. And these politicians, and many of them are your allies, felt they have been humiliated, mistreated seriously. So eventually, we have to give a definition, a clear one, to the phrase of national security. Why do you think the United States feels increasingly insecure? As the biggest economy, the most powerful military, the sole superpower in the wake of the Cold War, why do Americans feel unsafe?
So, as a very wise Chinese friend of mine said recently, globalization is very efficient, but it is also very unfair. And I think that that is profoundly true. That in the United States, the process of globalization has led to the collapse of a good number of labor-intensive industries. And this has led to economic suffering in certain regions of the United States, particularly in the South and the Midwest. And there has been a populist reaction to that in the election of a populist president. Now, this is not the first time that we have had a president that has been populist, but it is the first time in the era of very comprehensive globalization. America, of course, is not the only country with a populist government. But we are dealing with the effects of very rapid globalization and the unfairness of that. And that brings us back to the trade negotiations that are underway between the United States and China. This is an attempt, I think a good faith attempt by both governments to discuss the underlying issues here and come out with a better arrangement that allows both countries, both leaders, to present an agreement to their citizens and say, this is a good agreement for both of our countries. And I think our leadership is wise enough to realize that the benefits of that agreement are very significant. And the potential downside of no agreement is yet more significant. So this is a crucial moment in the history of China-U.S. bilateral relations. This is a crucial moment in the history of China's opening and reform process, and it is a crucial moment in the global economy. Let us hold hands, get an agreement, and then discuss our other substantial issues in greater detail over time.
Pretty wise remarks about globalization, the balanced picture about the efficiency and being unfair. Yes, a lot of damage has been done to our ecosystem, the environment, and due to migration, millions of children have been left behind. These are the problems China is facing because of urbanization and globalization. We have benefited enormously, but we have also paid our price. The United States have your own concerns and grievances. Let's come back to the underlying issues in four major areas:
yes.
Agriculture, financial, you name it.
Market access.
Market access, as well as the last area, exchange rate.
Exchange rates, yes.
Mm-hmm. Let's look at the exchange rate.
Yes.
China was accused of manipulating currency. Ever since the start of the trade war, Americans accused China of using exchange rate to minimize or mitigate the impact of, rising tariffs. So, well, what do you think of the approval of so many laws and regulations that the NPC has passed.
So on exchange rates, I think that the course of Chinese economic development over the last 20 years has been profoundly positive and profoundly successful. And part of that, particularly from 2000 and 2010, was careful control over the exchange rate. But those days are gone. And we see that very clearly by the fact that in 2019 China will have a trade balance, neither a trade surplus nor a trade deficit. So that would imply that China's exchange rate is roughly in balance, and any previous manipulation of the exchange rate is a part of history, not a part of our current affairs. So I think having agreements on exchange rates is useful. And I think our central bankers should be talking to each other frequently and coordinating frequently for stability in the exchange rate. And I think that that's what this arrangement will look like, not a radical change.
Let's look at the prospects of RMB strength bluntly. Mr. Yi Gang, the top banker, says there is no foundation for RMB to depreciate, or the other way around. It should fluctuate in a reasonable margin. What do you think of the future of RMB?
I have enormous respect for the central bank governor, and I agree with everything he says. I would note that China's trade relationship with the world is roughly in balance. That implies an exchange rate roughly in balance. It's going to go up and down a little bit. That is not manipulation. That is a very natural tendency. And my friends at the International Monetary Fund are very proud of China's exchange rate, and so I am going to concur with them.
Okay, so what about the access to the Chinese market?
Access to the Chinese market could be greatly improved. And I think when you look at all of the industries that are dominated by state-owned enterprises, be it financial or energy or aviation or construction or many, many others, that you have insufficient competition. And bringing in additional foreigners to compete in the areas dominated by the state-owned enterprises will give your economy life and growth and better opportunity and better products for Chinese citizens to enjoy. And thus, market access is important for American companies, but it is equally important for Chinese consumers. And there's a lot of improvements that could be made, particularly in those areas where state-owned enterprises are dominant. State-owned enterprises are responsible for between 35 and 43% of GDP in China. That is far too high. Private Chinese enterprises and foreign enterprises should be given greater scope to compete in all of those areas, and your economy will bloom like a beautiful flower.
Thank you so much for the encouraging picture. In fact, the domestic spending, which is one of the driving forces for sustaining the Chinese economy, will largely depend on the improvement of the service industry. And in this particular area, Americans and Europeans would have a lot to contribute, and that's mutually beneficial. The last issue, the last question, Craig, is whether we could trust President Trump. Because I've been following discussions on the social media, be they scholars, entrepreneurs coming back from the United States, be they who lived in the United States for years, who know your politics so well, or Chinese observers who have been doing American studies. They all come to the same conclusion. President Trump is very difficult to trust because he could easily overturn what has been agreed upon. It doesn't mean we don't trust the president, the personality, but it's a policy that is so unpredictable, so uncertain. We have a lot of risks in assessing the credibility of the Trump administration. Why should we trust him? This is an obsessively a concern for many Chinese and American. What do you think of this issue?
I can certainly understand your feelings on this subject. However, I would point out that President Trump has been extremely consistent about defending America's interests and trying to rebuild the manufacturing base and agriculture in the United States. We spoke earlier about populism and the loss of manufacturing at the regional level. And that is what the President is trying to address. And I will argue that Chinese investors, Chinese companies could be an excellent part of the solution to that problem. We have a good number of Chinese investors who have invested in economically depressed regions in the United States and are doing excellent work at providing employment. So the President prides himself on being a great negotiator, and he thinks that his philosophy is that to be a good negotiator requires that the other side feels some uncertainty. I won't argue with that, but what I will argue is that the President has been remarkably consistent at trying to defend core American manufacturing and agricultural interests, and it is in that consistency that we could strike an agreement that benefits America's core economic interests. And that, I will argue, is fundamentally in China's interest as well. It would be a very wise thing to replace Chinese exports to the United States with Chinese investment in the United States producing the same products. And we've seen a good number of very successful case studies in the paper industry, in the automotive industry, in the fish industry, and in the energy industry. So it is through further integration of our global economies that we can both win in this struggle. And you will find consistency in President Trump's message if you keep to the core, which is mutual economic advantage. And if we focus on that, then we're going to come out of this just fine.
Thank you so much, Craig. Whatever the uncertainties we both face, President Trump does deserve credit for consistently honoring his campaign pledges.
Yes.
The negotiations between our two economies involves national stakes for both sides. The issue is trust. It takes time to build trust. And I'm very happy that you agreed to be interviewed on my program Dialogue as a small step in the correct direction of trust building. I do appreciate your time and views.
I appreciate your time and views, and thank you very much.